Thank you, Ken. Well, there's no need for me to raise the curtain by talking about the substance of what the panel will be talking about for the next 90 minutes. I do want to say something about the event itself to amplify on something that Ken said. A university like ours consists of a lot of very smart and talented people who work very hard at what they're good at. Usually, it doesn't require them to work together, let alone pool their knowledge. And then along comes a real challenge to our collective understanding, our resolve, and not to be too melodramatic, our futures. And I think it's a pleasure to see this university of dedicated individuals and individualists can redefine itself as a community and come together for gatherings like this one, where we tap into what we spend most of our time overlooking, the fact that we live within a real treasure of people with experience and capabilities, our own faculty. So out of this, I hope will come some insight, maybe even some comfort. It's a pleasure to introduce our participants who come from all three components of Washington Lee, the Williams School of Commerce, the college, and the law school. Hold your applause. I'll introduce all of them, please. Denny Garver, the Assistant Professor of Management. Denny's a former attorney whose legal practice before heading back to graduate school in Washington, joining Washington Lee, involved corporate bankruptcy and business failure, including work for federal regulatory agencies during the banking crisis of the late 80s and early 90s. Denny's BA in law degrees are from the University of Iowa, his PhD in strategic management from Georgia State. Linda Hooks. Linda is the Cannon Professor of Economics, formerly an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, teaches money and banking, international finance. Her BA is from LSU Baton Rouge, her MA and PhDs from UCLA. David Millon, the Stambach Professor of Law at the Washington Law School, has taught business organizations and corporate law at W&L for 23 years and published extensively on issues related to corporate governance. David has a BA and MA from Iowa State, an MA and PhD in history from Cornell, and a law degree from Harvard. Pamela Luecke, the Reynolds Professor of Business Journalism, joined W&L in 2001 after a distinguished career as a newspaper editor in which she twice led reporters on Pulitzer Prize-winning projects. Pam has an MBA from the University of Hartford, a master's in journalism from Northwestern, and a BA from Carleton College. And Mark Rush, Robert Brown, Professor of Politics and Law, and the head of the Politics Department, and Director of the Program in International Finance and Commerce. Mark's expertise is constitutional law and voting rights. His BA is from Harvard, and MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins. As for me, I'm the Knight Professor of Journalism Ethics. I had a career as an editor and publisher, primarily in business and finance and journalism, and I write a media criticism column that runs in a number of newspapers. I was educated at Yale and the University of Paris, and my PhD is from the London School of Economics. So before we start, a couple of preliminary points. A round table like this should be like a diamond, with both brilliance and clarity. The brilliance, judging from the panel, won't be a problem. I worry a little bit about the clarity. These are difficult topics. Not all of us were born knowing that our mortgages actually get sold. So be kind. I'm going to feel free to jump in and ask for more patient explanations on some of these things. I'm going to invite the audience to put up their hands when they don't know what we're talking about. Even during the first half of the discussion, I figure the first 45 minutes, we'll have the panel do most of the talking, and we'll open it up to comments and questions from the audience. Since many of you are probably sufficiently qualified to be up here replacing us. The second point, I'd much rather have a lively discussion and an orderly one, so to you, our participants, feel free to talk as often, as vociferously as you like, ask each other questions, err on the side of brevity, let's keep things moving along. We have a lot of ground to cover: politics, culture, job, social stability, the edge of civilization. So, to start things off, how it happened. Linda, I was going to pitch this to you, Linda Hooks. Maybe you could give us a very brief scene setter for the fiasco that we're not going through.
I'd be happy to. Can everyone hear me okay with this? Okay. So how did it happen? Well, that too is complicated. Some of the roots of this problem go all the way back at least to the Great Depression. So at the surface level, how did this happen? It started with a problem in one major asset area, and that was the real estate market. That problem led to banks, and especially investment banks, having trouble with their own investments. That had a domino effect. Those investment banks were linked to other commercial banks, and to other kinds of financial companies, like insurance companies. That domino effect keeps growing. That's exactly the problem as economics describes it. So that is the surface explanation of what happened. Going back further, as I mentioned, to the Great Depression, you can trace a lot of government programs that actually set up some of this. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac started out as government programs, and they're certainly one of the players in the current crisis. The home loans that you hear about that are zero down payment home loans, and you wonder, how did somebody get that? Well, that's probably a VA loan, which was a program with a good purpose. So is that enough?
Well, so how is the fact that my house values were doing very well, and how is the fact that a lot of people were owning houses for the first time, which we generally see as a triumph of public policy, how did that lead us into this pickle?
Right, so public policy had a lot to do with it in the sense that we were actively trying to move people into houses. It's long been a part of the American culture, really, that one owns a house. That's just something you do in the U.S. So there were lots of government programs designed to do that. There was some pressure on them to increase the percentage of home ownership. And of course, when you do that, you move more towards the candidates who couldn't get financing before. And there was perhaps a reason they weren't getting financing before.
Which was? They weren't good credits.
They perhaps were not good credit risk by the initial definition of credit risk. So the credit standards got changed a little bit, and these people became eligible. And it actually had at least one good outcome for a while anyway. They did own a home.
So would it be correct to say that vast numbers of people were suddenly foreclosing on their mortgages, and that's what triggered this collapse, or was?
I think that's a fair assessment of the trigger. Economists talk about these sort of crises as having sort of a pivotal moment when something happens and it's enough to start the cascade. So the falling home prices combined with this relatively new group of homeowners, as you're talking about, really was what set things in motion.
Can I just ask though, if these had been sort of the old-fashioned mortgages still held at your local bank or savings and loan, would we be where we are now? Isn't it the fact that that they were sold, mortgages were sold and additional financial instruments were built on the framework, a shaky framework, that really resulted in the mess that we're in?
I think that's right. There was definitely more building on top of these assets than we had known in the past. But again, home mortgages have actually been sold for a long time. A lot of the abbreviations of fancy assets that you hear being thrown around, they're 20 years old easily. So it's not brand new, but there certainly was a buildup that hadn't been there before.
Following up on that, can people hear me without a microphone? Is that all right? Okay.
I think they can, but I'm not sure that the tape will.
Oh, all right.
Really.
Okay. How about this? Is it on? Help to turn it on. Right.
This is going to be posted, by the way. This will be on the university's site. You should assume that this is going to be universally accessible to anybody with a computer. Wonders of YouTube.
I thought I would follow up just a little bit on Pam's question and Linda's points that she's just made about the secondary market. You know, you go to the bank and you get a home loan, a bank or a mortgage company. The bank then takes these loans and sells them into the secondary market. People will buy a bunch of these loans, package them, and then sell interest in that package to investors, and those are the so-called mortgage-backed securities. And the development of a very robust, it's true these things, the secondary market's been around for a while, but for some reason it really exploded in the last, well, maybe the last 10 years or so, 5 years at least. And of course, once there's a demand for these loans in a secondary market, that increases people. As long as you know somebody will buy the loan, you're going to go out there more willingly and make a loan in the first instance. And so that drove part of the willingness of these banks and mortgage companies to make these loans, so-called prime loans that previously might not have been made. Somebody's willing to buy them and then sell them to investors. And of course that in turn, the availability of more credit drives up the price of houses. You know, the housing bubble is a big part of this. As you all know, house prices got very inflated. That has ended. The bubble, the housing bubble has burst. That has also made these loans a lot less valuable, these income streams a lot less valuable than they previously would have been. And so when you hear about these toxic assets or toxic investments, the investment banks, the commercial banks, investors are holding these mortgage-backed securities that were supposed to be backed by the cash flow from these mortgages, from the people who borrowed the money to buy the houses. But if that cash flow dries up, the mortgage-backed securities then become of doubtful value. And that's really the immediate problem. The banks have these assets on their balance sheets for which there's no market. Nobody is willing to buy and sell these mortgage-backed securities now, and so they have no market value, although they do have some value, some economic value, because there is still some cash flow behind them. But that has really kind of brought things to a head, and that's why the banks are borderline insolvent right now and are unwilling to lend to businesses and to each other because they don't have enough capital. These assets, these mortgage-backed security assets, are of such limited value now that they don't have enough capital. They don't feel comfortable lending their capital because they're worried that then they'll default on their own obligations to other lenders.
You know, sometimes the discussions are almost like listening to meteorologists talking about weather systems. These impersonal forces obeying fairly logical physical laws, and as a result, we get our houses blown down. But this was, didn't we see this in the late 80s? Isn't this what the savings and loan meltdown was then? What was different about this? Why were there why did public policy regulations seem, if anything, to go backwards since then? Danny, maybe you want to...
Well, I guess
There's a magic box.
right?
There's supposed to be. See, this is what happens when you get too many PhDs in the room.
I just
Try it.
There are similarities in some ways the financial innovations that we saw after that period were supposed to resolve this, but at the time in the 80s you had savings and loans who were in the business of basically borrowing short to lend long. Okay, their short-term cash needs came from depositors or other short-term instruments, and they were making traditional long-term mortgages. And then when you have problems in the mortgage markets, then you have these liquidity issues and effectively a run on the bank. There's not enough cash to run this, and so after some of the capacity and other legal reforms were put into place after that first savings and loan fiasco, the mortgage-backed securities and these other entities were intended to get around that, to overcome those issues. Instead of a single institution holding the instruments and holding them to maturity and keeping that risk themselves by selling them into the market and letting them be packaged and then traded, that was supposed to diversify that kind of risk. One difference to me from the current time to that prior time is that in the previous, people still talked about saving and investing, whether it was with the mortgages or with the S&Ls or with the banks. And even investment advisors, investment specialists still talked about that. And over the last 3 to 5 years, it seems like there's a shift in mindset between investors and importantly with traders. That instead of people talking about investing, saving and investing, instead they were talking about borrowing and betting. Okay, and that investments now were this entity or this group making this kind of an investment. And part of the problem I've seen, I guess, in terms of the current generation of these instruments is that instead of companies actually, or investors actually having an asset that they're investing in, they're effectively investing in an equation. 100 mortgages are brought together, they're packaged, they're bundled, Within that contract holding the investments, a certain level of investor gets a tranche, and that tranche gets the first 70% of payments from the highest credit borrowers in that bundle, and then you have these different levels of risk. And so the investors or traders are effectively buying an equation, and that value is only derived after you see what everything else happens. Well, that is, to me, substantively different than making a traditional investment in terms of knowing what you're getting involved in, knowing what's happening there. And so the attempt to diversify the risk introduced a lot of complexity in the system that people just didn't take into account.
Mark, did you have something? I was hoping you might want to say something about the retreat from regulation.
I can. I think I'll defer to these guys. Their expertise on that, I can defer to them.
I would like to talk about that actually, Ed, because you talked about retreat from regulation, and many of the critics of what's been going on, including Obama, are talking about deregulation, and they're saying there's been a lot of deregulation during the last 8 years in particular. Really, I don't think that's accurate. I mean, there are a few examples. A statute was repealed that separated investment banking from commercial banking, and commercial banks then got into investment banking, and investment banks then had to get bigger, and that caused some problems. In 2004, the Securities Exchange Commission eliminated a rule about leverage that allowed investment banks to leverage themselves to 30 to 1 or 32 to 1. And that was a fact.
Can you break that down for us? What's the difference between an investment bank and a commercial bank, and what's leverage?
Commercial banks are banks that take deposits and make loans to local businesses. Investment banks are banks that are really involved in underwriting securities and trading on their own account and that sort of thing. And historically, they were separated for political reasons. It really goes back to the post-Depression New Deal. Linda knows more about this than I do. But that law, the GlassSteagall Act, was repealed in 1999. Commercial banks had moved into investment banking. Investment banks then needed to raise more capital to get bigger to compete with the commercial banks, and then that added fuel to this fire. Leverage is just borrowed money, and the investment banks were borrowing $30 on the dollar to invest in things like these mortgage-backed securities. Incredibly high leverage, and when the securities end up being less valuable than people thought, they're in a big bind, and that's really the main reason why Lehman Brothers went down, filing bankruptcy. They ended up insolvent. But my larger point is that I don't really think it is a matter of deregulation as such. I think you have to go all the way back to 1980 and the so-called Reagan Revolution, and this new philosophy that was anti-government, anti-regulation, and pro-market. And since then, Democrats as well as Republicans, generally speaking, have not thought that regulation was the way to go. So rather than deregulation, I would talk in terms of failure of regulation. And we've had a series of financial mini-crises leading up to this one. This is only the worst. We had the dot-com bubble, we had the corporate takeover problems in the 1980s. We had the accounting scandals that culminated in Enron and all of that. All of this is going on, and government is basically sitting on the sidelines. It's a failure to regulate rather than deregulation that really leads us to the problem, and that is based, again, on this political philosophy that is anti-government, anti-regulation, and pro-so-called free market. And that's really what has gotten us into this situation, 30 years of that, and it does need to change. I think we now know it needs to change, because government can no longer sit on the sidelines now. If we don't prop up the banking system, the entire economy really will collapse. And so I think everybody recognizes that we needed to inject some capital into the banks to watch their bank failure.
But I think one of the interesting things about that is that there is also a level of government involvement that's very deep in these markets. Commercial banks, for example, are highly regulated, not investment, but commercial banks. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, even when they went private, it was public knowledge that they had a credit line, a large credit line with the U.S. Treasury. Well, how can they be private if they can borrow whenever they need to from our own government? So there's also this huge government angle there that was perhaps well-intentioned government programs that weren't well thought out. So it's an odd mix in that way.
Would you put Freddie and Fannie in that category as well-intentioned but not well thought out?
Right, Freddie and Fannie both were designed to increase home ownership. If that is a value of the American culture, that was a reasonable way to go about it.
No, I wanted to ask you about something David said, that the GlassSteagall Act was passed for political reasons. And I wonder if you would agree with that that the two types of banks were separated for, and insurance too, wasn't it? Were separated for political reasons, or was it for public policy reasons? And I guess I see a distinction between the two. Maybe you didn't intend. Why were
Linda's
they
the banking expert,
originally?
she knows a lot.
Why were they originally separated, and why did we think it was a good idea more recently to change that?
Well, I was impressed with how much you know, David. So,
For a lawyer,
yeah. So the GlassSteagall Act, at the time that they passed it, they actually thought there was an economic reason for passing it. They thought that the investment banking part of commercial banking had driven the banks to the failures that they were experiencing. So they really saw an economic reason, and that gave them a public policy reason to do this. It made sense. It was the way to stabilize the banking system in the U.S. Economists have done a lot of work on that question since then, and they've really failed to find that economic link that seems so obvious in the moment. So in retrospect, I think one could say that maybe it did have political more than public policy elements.
But it was also true that the federal government was insuring deposits in commercial banks. And so as long as they're going to insure, the depositor wanted to limit the amount of exposure that commercial banks could take on. So there was a certain, they weren't offering investment banks anything like that kind of assurance.
That's right. They really needed to do that, and since that they were going to provide insurance, and they couldn't cover everything, or at least they didn't think they could. And I agree with that.
So I mean, if that's the logic, then going forward, and we're sort of getting ahead of the thing, but I'm wondering now with this enormous amount of money being pumped into the banking system, what's the quo for the quid? I mean, they're getting preferred shares. They're going to have this equity position in these banks, but then is there also, or should there be some limitation on the amount of exposure, the amount of leverage? Is that the direction the regulation is now heading?
And one of the questions is, what are the banks going to do with all this money that our money, your all's money, that we're giving them right now? And it isn't entirely clear. The hope is that they will revive the credit markets and start lending it, but there isn't really any guarantee they'll do that. Some money is still being paid out to common shareholders in the form of dividends. They've got to hold on to a fair amount of capital because they're worried about their own exposure, their own obligation to pay back their own long-term debt borrowings. So I think, and I'd like to hear what Linda and the others think about this. I think that's a big question right now. First, that we put enough money in there really to revive the credit markets, and second, it isn't clear who's going to decide how the money is going to be used and whether it really will do what it's supposed to do.
Well, my understanding is on the money that's being infused, that there's the preferred stock component, which is short-term. It is effectively to prevent a run on the bank, so that the largest banks don't run out of cash. And you've got the 7 largest, plus there's a couple of clearing banks where the need was there. And for a couple of those banks, Wells Fargo specifically, they said they didn't want it and were basically strong-armed into taking it, so that wouldn't have sent a signal as far as which banks are in better shape than others. The other programs that they're starting to develop do start to target specific elements. So, there's the Fed's involvement with commercial paper. Commercial paper is a market that the largest companies, multinational companies, use for short-term funding needs. So you have companies like GE, Microsoft, anybody like that going into the market, borrowing on a short-term basis, and the market conditions have gotten to the point that people were not willing to lend to a company like GE for more than 3 or 4 days. Well, I mean, if there's as good a credit as you can get as GE, it's pretty unrealistic to think that people had gotten that fearful that they had. So So that piece is targeted, and once the market starts to work, I would guess that the Fed would exit. The initial injection or the initial program was to do something with these troubled assets. The feedback that's coming back, and in some sense, comparing the savings and loan and banking crisis to this crisis, is that you get feedback quicker, you get information quicker, and changes happen on a more rapid basis. I can remember Congress fighting and Bob Dole actually fighting for months on end as to what was going to happen in the last savings and loan problems. Well, now the program to buy these troubled assets, people have said that's not going to happen quick enough, there's too much uncertainty, and you're starting to see some movement away from that. Today, I think the FDIC chief, Sheila Blair, who really seems to be on top of things from the commercial banking side, was going to propose a $40 billion plan to target home loans. And people saying, all right, well, if you do it on that side, that addresses another need in the system. So even though at times they'll be talking about big numbers, there do seem to be some very specific programs that are targeted at specific needs that seem to increase in priority over that time.
Another thing that has struck me as different with this crisis compared to the savings and loan crisis is how quickly it became global. And I wonder if any of you can shed light on the interconnectedness of our financial markets now in contrast to maybe 20 or 30 years ago. It seems to me that our financial markets caught the flu, and suddenly everybody now has a mortal disease.
Well, there was a global element to the Great Depression too. It was very clear that a lot of us were in it together. So in some ways that's not a new kind of development, but the more recent things like the savings and loan crisis was more US based. Certainly one of the explanations has to be these complex assets that people have bought that connect people in all kinds of new ways. While they're at least 20 or 30 years old, they weren't very prominent for that S&L crisis, and now they're a fairly common thing. European banks have been experiencing their own deregulation as the European Union wants to have some very large banks that will compete, some very good banks, that is, that will compete with U.S. banks. And I think increasingly European banks look to the U.S. for a model. So to the extent they look to the U.S. for a model, they ended up with exactly our goal.
Can I raise, is this thing on? I don't know. Yes? No? Does this work?
I think so.
I just want to raise a question about that because I think it's in some ways inaccurate to refer to this as an American flu that everybody else caught. There was a wonderful schadenfreude about all this in the European papers as they celebrated the superiority of the European approach to banking, investment, community, capitalism, risk, and whatnot. And then, they very quietly went about trying to get their own houses back in order before the Financial Times told us all of this was happening over there. There seems to be, there was a global presumption that there would be growth, that there would be expansion of wealth, that risk was worth assuming. And yet throughout all this, long before it hit here, there was a housing problem in Europe all summer long, and it didn't get any press here. And yet if you look around, in some ways, Europe's been going through this right with us. And so one of the things I wanted, based on that, ask you all who are more familiar with the business end of this than I am by far. When will we get back to sort of normal times? We have assumed for such a long time that there would be growth. That's the underpinning of a welfare state. We'll all have 10 kids, and they'll pay enough taxes that can support our retirement, so we'll all be fine.
So work hard.
Yeah, so
work
work
out there. Get the really good jobs, pay your taxes on time.
Yeah, and keep rooms in your houses so your parents can move back in with you.
The welfare states didn't have lower birth rates, though.
Well, but that's it. So there was always the assumption that there'd be somehow more to support us. So we could assume to take on the debts, assume that there would be people to pay into our retirements. They're not there now. We have a problem. We assumed that there would be growth, that somebody would be dumb enough to buy all these cheap, subprime mortgages up. And by the time I got around to potentially defaulting, someone would take that house off my hands, and I'd be okay, and they'd be okay, and so forth. This was based on an optimism that just simply was uninformed. So now we're in this situation. what will the situation look like that will begin to foster a willingness to take risk again? Even in just regular good investments, if you can't get credit, you don't know what to do with the money right now. So if I can throw that back out to the bankers and the business folks.
Good question.
Oh, sure, okay, go ahead.
Well, I'll try. So, on just economic terms, growth in the U.S. is not exactly a guarantee, but it's a good deal. The typical recession, this is since World War II, has lasted less than a year. The average is 11 months. So, does the U.S. have a long history of sustained growth? Yes, it does. Is past performance a predictor of future performance? No, it's not. So I really think that we will get back to normal, and it will be sooner rather than later because we have that past history, even though it's not a perfect predictor. But certainly we aren't there yet.
I wonder, the short-term consequence right now seems really perverse because you have a flow of financial capital back into the U.S. because of uncertainties abroad. The dollar is now strengthening against everybody. The enormous increase in Treasury borrowing, selling of Treasury bonds, has attracted huge amounts of money from abroad, which is how we got into this problem in the first place, by borrowing to finance our own merchandise trade deficit. So here we are again, back on the needle of lavish, promiscuous borrowing from abroad. And I guess where I'm going with it, we've talked about the financial problems. What about the economic problems? Where are we now heading? We've introduced the notion of a recession, which is different from a financial meltdown. Where are we heading now in terms of the real economy?
I think that's for me. Okay, well, sure, recession most likely. Lots of people are talking about a recession now. We don't have evidence, hard evidence of that yet, but that's often the case. Unemployment has been rising a little bit, but unemployment tends to be a lagging indicator of recession, so it's sort of the last thing to go up. And all the other signs suggest, yeah, we're going to have trouble. They are linked. Financial crisis leads to a recession if it grows as big as this, and that's exactly why we all need to be concerned about the financial crisis. We aren't just bailing out some high-flying CEOs on Wall Street. We're bailing ourselves out here. We really need it.
I think that Mark's point is very interesting, and I think this pullback from markets worldwide is evidence of what you're talking about, is enormous risk aversion. Pamela, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about whether we were warned about this, whether the business media had done their job in setting up enough yellow flares that we should have seen this coming.
Well, it's sort of related to what Mark was talking about, because there's a big psychological dimension to this, I think, and to the financial markets. I was thinking we should have a psychology professor up here. And a lot of times people develop their attitudes about the economy and the financial markets through the media's coverage of it. My impression, and it's just an impression because I don't think there's been a thorough review of the financial press coverage of this run-up. My impression is that the print media in particular did a much better job in advance of this financial crisis than they did for the dot-com bubble. And I think we were all chastened by our performance in the late 90s, where we sort of bought in, we drank the Kool-Aid, we thought, you know, that's true, you don't have to make profits anymore. The internet changes everything, and we sort of fanned the flames of the fires that were burning and that were heating up the dot-com bubble. But I think there have been some really tremendous stories done in the print media for the past several years, not just in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, but in regional papers too, which I get a chance to see regularly just because of journalism contests, et cetera, and papers like Charlotte and in the Midwest and out West have been writing about their own overheated housing markets and looking closely at that and how sustainable it is. The broadcast business media, I think, are a very different entity, and I think there was a lot more criticism of their performance in the dot-com boom, and they were roundly criticized for their sort of role in stoking the stock market then. And I don't watch CNBC 24 hours a day the way some people do. And I think there probably is some legitimate criticism about their role not only in the build-up, but also now in the unwinding, that I think they are perhaps contributing to the fear and the panic that is out there. Because if you watch real time what's going on in the stock market, it's very scary, and it's probably hard not to respond by bailing out of the stock market. So it's I'm reluctant to, and I urge people not to lump the news media in one basket. I think that there's a proliferation of business media out there now, and they're performing in different ways.
Following up on that, Pam, I was doing some reading today, and I found an article in the Times from March '05, the first sentence of which was this: real estate crazed Americans have started behaving in ways that eerily recall the stock market recession of the late 90s. The analogy was drawn clearly to the dot-com bubble of the late 90s, the housing boom, where in some markets houses were being bought and sold twice in one day. Again, because easy money, easy credit was available, prices went way up, and of course it was a crash in housing prices that really precipitates the larger economic crisis of confidence in the value of these mortgage-backed securities. So, yeah, I mean, people, astute observers, knew that there was a big risk here. Certainly the people who were in a position to do something about it, like Alan Greenspan, who today in Congress admitted to the House committee that it was interrogating him that he was wrong. He thought that the banking system could regulate itself. He believed that for 40 years, and he said I was wrong. And he was quite candid about that. But the warning signs were there. People like him to act on if they wanted to, but I think everybody was still in the thrall of this political philosophy that said government not only can't, but shouldn't do anything in these private markets.
So what should we have done in 2005?
Well, you could have done things, looked at leverage, excess leverage problems. That was clearly there. The mortgage-backed security, if you know the housing prices are the bubble's about to burst, you know that these assets are serious risk, and you know that all the banks are heavily invested in them, you know they're going to have a balance sheet problem real soon, right? I mean, that would have been an obvious thing to look at.
But there was a lack of transparency in some areas too, in which I'm not sure the media really could have gotten in. So the thing that everybody's been talking about recently are these credit default swaps, which are essentially insurance on defaults, loan defaults. But the trick is you didn't have to own that loan to get the insurance. So you could just buy and buy and buy. Okay, well that's the kind of asset that gets traded not in the public eye. And so I wonder how the media would know about it and what they could report on it.
Well, they can't, and I think although the media have gotten better at actually looking at financial statements, those don't show up on financial statements as far as I know. So how would we know about it when in fact some very smart people on Wall Street didn't know about them? I think we've all been a little alarmed when people say, gosh, I had no idea that these were such a big deal, which would be an argument for regulation of new financial instruments, or at least disclosure of financial instruments.
One suggestion would be never to write admiringly about a business you don't understand. And certainly it's the fault of the business press in writing about amazingly profitable companies, whether Enron or some of these financial companies, not really knowing how they make their money.
Right, but the credit default swaps are not, as far as I understand, are not how the company makes money. They're sort of an insurance policy. So the company may look fine, and it doesn't occur to you to ask, gosh, you have a lot of exposure with these credit default swaps, because know it hasn't in the first place.
Well, here's one topic. The endless confidence that Americans have had in the appreciation of their property. That their homes were going, although yes, we understand that there has been cyclicity in home prices in the past, but basically it's the safest investment you'll ever own. Don't worry about it. Improve your house, don't worry about it. And this was just fundamentally false. It was it was not, Americans in thinking about their retirements, their home savings was the one rock, the one thing they could count on. And I wonder whether there shouldn't have been a much more pronounced sense of skepticism in the way the media were encouraging people to think about it. And there wasn't a sense that there shouldn't have been instilled in people a sense of, let's not be so sure.
Well, who would say that?
Yeah,
I mean, would you have the guys from CNBC come on daily and say, you know, your home isn't worth as much as you want? I mean, that's, when you say the skepticism, where would it come from?
I mean, well, that's a great point. But you think about an entire edifice of coverage built around the rock solid, the fact that your home is a rock solid investment. There's a whole world of coverage about home improvement, a whole world of coverage about things you can do, things that will impact your price, will increase its ever increasing value. There's a whole industry devoted to, built upon this bedrock assumption that your house is a great investment rather than potentially a very risky one. And then encouraging people to think very skeptically about their homes, encouraging people not to upgrade in a market that's already overheated. I mean,
I guess I challenge your assumption that the media writ large were all singing that same tune. I just don't think that's the case. I mean, I think certainly there were magazines or news articles that did that, but I think there were probably an equal number that were not doing that. You know, perhaps you should review your selection of reading materials. If you look at my track record in the housing market, you know, you wouldn't have that. I seem to go to all markets and buy high and sell low, but you know, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah. I guess what would you suggest, though? I mean, that's a mantra I think every one of us has heard: get out, get a job, stop renting, buy a house, make wealth. What, I guess, would the alternative now be? Certainly not buy a boat, buy a car, just salt it away and make it, you know, it's just, that really undercuts, you know, the principle of the mechanism of growth in the economy. Anybody can go out there and buy a house, I mean, eventually, and pay it off.
I'm not a personal finance guy, but people tell me that under certain circumstances, it's a lot more beneficial to rent, and even though you get a tax break, and that it becomes, you're right, it has become almost a part of the creed that as an American you should aspire to a 30-year fixed rate mortgage of your very own. All I'm saying is there are smart people out there who can show you and show you the numbers and tell you should be renting. And I'm just suggesting that this is an instance where large numbers of people subscribing to this somewhat unchallengeable, unshakable belief that they have a duty as citizens under the Constitution to own a house is part of the problem, and public policy then followed that by extremely permissive practices and keeping rates low. And rates should have been much higher. Interest rates should have been much higher. We could have averted some of this if they hadn't been quite so promiscuous in lowering rates a few years ago.
This sort of blind faith in the idea that home prices are going to continue to appreciate forever was only an example of a much larger phenomenon that is at the heart of this whole thing, this irrational optimism that we're going to have continued growth. That fuels the stock market bubbles. It fueled the overinvestment in these mortgage-backed securities that most people didn't even understand, including the professionals. It's a kind of it's referred to as irrational optimism in the context of the dot-com bubble, but I think it goes beyond that. And I think, you know, pointing the finger at homeowners for making, you know, borrowing too much money in order to buy that house is not fair, because they're not doing anything any differently than anybody else was doing. The investment bankers were borrowing billions of dollars to make bad investments. It's the same thing. People just wanted to improve their lives using other people's money based on a faith in the future that was completely unwarranted.
Can I follow that up
No,
too, just a
no,
little?
completely unwarranted is a pretty strong statement, don't you think? I mean, they were smart people all the way along that were applying, some fairly standard criteria in terms of making their decisions. So completely unwarranted?
Okay, almost completely.
Two things. I mean, I find it ironic, but I'll join my fellow Red Sox fan here in saying, irrational optimism could be a problem. We're experts in it, but not anymore, right?
It's rational now.
Now it's rational optimism. No, but Dave, I say, I mean, we promote this across the board. Our kids take out college loans and go to schools that, if they just stayed home and went to State U, it's all based on the assumption they're going to get a job down the road that will allow them to pay off massive amounts of debt. We encourage them to go to professional school and so forth. I mean, so to focus simply on the housing market, fine, fair enough, but really the educational system is based on essentially the same sort of speculation. We could really bring this home. It would be great for the state university system, but no one wants to aspire to that. The goal as well is that you can go to any college you want and don't let money stand in your way. So we're really talking about a public philosophy that needs reorienting, I think, and it's not just money, banks, houses, it's education and everything else as well.
Well, but I watched It's a Wonderful Life, right? Okay, and Jimmy Stewart, when he goes out to Martini's house, right? And he gets him out of the Pottersville, right? And they buy their house, and they give him the salt and the bread and the wine, right? I mean, that's a magical moment. But also, I think the data would show it does improve people's lives to, move from a rental to a homeowner's position, and that there are policy reasons to support that. And if you think about, just in terms of business sense, if you talk about the real estate, it's not the media maybe that's overly optimistic, but you've got realtors who have a vested interest in being optimistic. You've got your builders. You've got you got the co-op that's going to come out and work on my furnace next week, right? So I mean, it spreads out in a lot of different ways, actually.
And we have a fundamental policy promoting homeownership in our income tax structure. I don't know, you know more about that than I do. I don't know how far back it dates, but that is a major incentive from an economic sense to own a home. I'll also just say, from an economic standpoint, that real estate is a unique market. There is, in a sense, a fixed supply of that, and that makes the economics a little bit different. Now, maybe if you're in Japan, you go out and build a new island, but most of us don't do that.
Dubai.
So there really is a limit to real estate, and that makes it more susceptible to these sorts of sharp rises and drops. That's part of what underlies it. Real estate bubbles aren't actually all that unusual.
Before we take questions from the floor, I want to throw out a big picture question and ask Mark to talk a little about this. But do you see this as the kind of defining moment politically that's going to mark a break and mark a kind of search for a different philosophy of governance? Has this thing that David has been talking about from the dereg that is always associated with Reagan, and I remember airline dereg started with Carter, but has that deregulation wave now crested, and now with this enormous government infusion of money in the financial market and taking shares, are we turning a corner here? Are there going to be a debate about changes in philosophies of governance?
Sure, I think in general, if there's been an era of really calling for small government and wanting government to get off your backs, is a very good reason presented across the media, across the economy, that yes, we need government to become more involved in at least the regulation of the economy, and perhaps then what other sectors of our lives do we want the government to become involved in. So I think you'll see a bit of a swing back towards calling for more government regulation. But again, for how long? Things will get good again, and I think we'll just, a new wave of optimism will take over and government will retrench. So perhaps in the short run, yeah, I think you're going to see a big swing, at least in terms of electoral forces, from one party to the other. Will the Democrats be able to do anything really to sustain an era of pro-government, governmental intervention? I don't know.
Ed, can I follow up on that? Because this question is of great interest to me as I think about all of this. we're dealing with the short-term economic problem now, and then in the slightly longer term, there is going to be a shift from markets back to regulation, at least in the financial sector. And I think there's also even hope that government might get involved in healthcare and energy policy and education policy finally, after being negligent for at least 30 years. But what I'm concerned about, what I worry about, is whether there's actually going to be a reorientation of fundamental values in this country away from an ethic of, for want of a better term, greed, or something else, something that is a little bit more concerned about other values like community and that sort of thing. And unless that happens, there'll be another financial crisis, because the law and regulation is always one step behind. It's always playing catch up. If this same ethic of greed is still out there and continues to flourish, people who are behind these things will come up with something else, and we'll have another problem on our hands 5 years down the road. So, what's interesting to me when you talk about a watershed moment, Ed, is if this is a watershed moment, that's what it needs to be. And I don't know whether it will be. I don't know if the law can't change people's thinking or values that way. A single person, Barack Obama, can't change people's thinking or values that way. It has to be it would be a much more complex and phenomenon if it were to happen. For me, that's the most interesting, important question of all.
Jacob, you had a question?
It was actually going back to the discussion about owning a home.
Stand up and let everybody hear you.
I guess the question was how we switched from buying a home being something you did to improve your life or move to a nicer neighborhood and have a nice backyard for your kids to grow up in, and why it became an investment. Because it seems like you were talking about two different things to each other. Half of you were talking about the home as the place where you move and you live there for 40 years, and you were worried about your home investment and your retirement. Is your home an investment, or is your home where you live? And can it be both?
Well, while this housing bubble was in full force and it burst about a year ago, a lot of people were viewing homes as simple investments. People would move into a town like ours, they would buy a home, and they would put a little bit of money in, and they would quote, flip the home, to somebody else. No intention ever lived there, probably didn't even move in. So for some people, it was an investment pure and simple. I think for a lot of other people, it was mixed. It's a place to live for a few years, but you are hoping that with appreciation, you'll be able to sell it at a profit and move to a bigger house later on. So I think maybe attitudes have changed a little bit. We are thinking about homes more as investments and less as simply a place to live and raise a family and all of that.
And they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, it's possible to purchase a home, to live in it and also hope that it will appreciate, or to purchase a home to live in it and also have real estate investment as a hobby or a sideline by which you make money. So I don't know that there's anything fundamentally different about investing in real estate, hoping it will appreciate, and investing in stocks and hoping they will appreciate.
Well, right, there is an old-fashioned name for this. It's get rich quick. And that game's as old as the country and older than that.
Or even get rich slowly. I mean, the hope that investments will appreciate doesn't necessarily have to be labeled greed. I mean, it can, there is a continuum there.
I mean, one way that can get played out is if you see a change in the underwriting of homes. I mean, it used to be that there was a significant down payment that was required. Some of the senior members in the audience could tell you what they probably had to put down in their first home, but for me it was 20%. And I know for my parents and grandparents it was quite a bit more. Right? So that tempered people's expectations. And then when you bought that house, then it meant something, but then you paid it off over time, and it kind of took care of itself that way. Well, if you have a 90% loan or 95% or 100%, the signature loan, which became known as the liar loans, then you're shifting kind of an emphasis on really what might happen with respect to that house.
Can I just add a point though? I mean, we talked about the short. I mean, you can look at this through many different lenses: get rich quick, or supporting a community, whatever the case may be. But I'm speaking broad terms about things such as the American dream or whatever. This is a nation that if you describe some of its typical characteristics, one of them certainly includes mobility. And so that home better be an investable property, because presumably, you don't intend to necessarily retire in your first home. You hope maybe to get a better job somewhere else, or maybe get that home nearby school and then move back to your home someday and so forth. And if you can't assume that there will be growth and profit so that you can actually live in a place and then move elsewhere, that really changes the way we view the entire economy and the nature of our culture. And I'm not going to try to speak as some sort of cultural maven or anything, but I just think, well, if we change the formula to to go back to It's a Wonderful Life, and that's where movement in that town was 3 streets over, and that was it. That's a radically different picture. I mean, ask our own kids. My son let me know 3 years ago he wasn't going to school here, he was going to school elsewhere. Maybe he'll return, but in order for him to do that, it's predicated on the assumption that a house or something, a condo, will be an investable property from which he'll be able to get the springboard to come back here. So I think we're talking about a much broader picture than simply saying, is a house a place to live, or is a house an investment? It really reflects a set of cultural values.
Unless you're renting, unless you're in a society where where you need to get 80% of the money up front and borrow 20 rather than borrow the 80. And many countries are like that. Many countries you basically don't borrow much, if anything, when you buy a place, and not many people buy. I'd like to pick up on the greed thing, because I'm so curious about how this all looks for the students. I sort of have this, as some of you do, this suspicion that we're seeing a transformative moment here, and that some very, very big, important, profoundly fundamentals are shifting here. And I've also watched with some despair, as some of you have over the last 20 years, when you see younger people, and the ones who are really, really smart and really want to make something of themselves, are going into investment banking, which was always a source of great disappointment to me. And I'm just wondering what, I'm wondering some of the students, what do you think's going on? I mean, how has this now colored the world that you think you're heading into?
Where were those profits coming from? Well, gee, as it turns out, we just found out where they were coming from. So there was this market signal going out saying all the bright people go to investment banking because that's where they're getting paid the most. And it wasn't really a very accurate signal. I don't know if the students could recognize that.
What about, do you think students, here feel...
I can't hear you.
I don't know, maybe other students can answer this. If there's pressure to go into high-paying jobs because we go to a school that's really expensive, maybe you're not going to be in debt yourself, but don't you think, like, if your parents have sunk, I don't know, $150,000, $200,000 in you now, do you need to pay mom and dad back with a nice, you can buy a nicer Christmas
Call it
present.
ROI, return on investment. Well, there's students out there. What do you guys think?
Look, it's a huge problem with people going to law school with the intention of, serving the poor, and they end up with $150,000 in debt. That's a little bit outside of it. Go ahead.
Well, it does speak to the values that we as a society hold and what the definition of a life well lived is. And I think if you think at the end of your life, the person with the most money wins, you will pursue one course, and if you have other ways of measuring success and happiness, you may choose another course. Sort of gets back to what David was saying about how you change a society's point of view, and that's a complicated question. I don't think it's something that happens overnight or from one place. It's all of our institutions, and rethinking why we're here, and why we're at a liberal arts institution, and how we think about what it means to live a life well.
You mentioned the culture of greed and the anti-government impulse that may be responsible for some of this. But what about isn't there another piece, what about the culture of consumption? Sort of the broader idea of total freedom where, we all, everyone, thought that you're entitled to have anything you want, a bigger house, or a house in the first place that you couldn't afford, or a 20% a year return on your 401k that you know nothing about how it's invested or where it's going to. And what my question is, I guess, do you think that if there is some sort of a paradigm shift in this country, even if we do get a more activist government, but the culture stays the same. And I mean, when I watch congressional hearings, I see no national trend towards sackcloth and ashes and what were we thinking. All I see is anger. Where's my 401k? Where's my rising real estate values? And who can I put in jail because they took it from me? I guess, what does everyone think? Is there some sort of a change in government policy? Is that going to be enough, or is that even going to be good if there's no change in how people think about things and what people aspire to?
Well, that was my question. I mean, government can do some things in the short term, in my opinion. This is my own political preference here. I'm happy to acknowledge that. We need help in healthcare, we need help in energy policy, we need to get out of the war in Iraq, we need to do something about public education. There's a fairly obvious list to me that government can do some useful things there. We can have more regulation in the financial markets. We're going to get it whether we like it or not, because that's the way Congress works. But is that going to fundamentally change our outlook or our values? I don't think so necessarily at all. Government can't do that for us. Government, well, I'll take that back. I think government can play a role. I mean, Ronald Reagan was an amazing leader. He really was. I think he did really help people to rethink what their priorities were. I think he really did, and to a certain extent, they grew much more respectable than they've been in our country in the past. And the whole voodoo economics thing, the idea that if you and I go out and try to get as rich as we can, somehow that'll help poor people because the wealth will trickle down. People seem to believe that. McCain still says it, so it's still a belief that has some currency. Can government change fundamental values? No. Should it try to? Probably not. I don't know how these things change. I think they change on their own. Government can play a role, though.